China is supposed to, or to be ready to invade Taiwan in 2027. A lot of people think that this would be easy for China, that China could easily take Taiwan. It's not a big deal. And that makes sense on the surface. When you look at how small Taiwan is, how large China is, how China's been building ships lately and more advanced military equipment. But why haven't they done it? There are lots of reasons, and we're going to get into those today. Because if it were easy, it would have been done. Taiwan's a lot harder to invade than you would think. So in World War II, the United States considered invading Taiwan to cut off the Japanese supply lines. But after studying the island's rugged mountains, the sharp coastlines, the narrow landing zones, military planners actually scrapped this idea. They called it a fortress island. General Douglas MacArthur reportedly said the terrain was unsuitable for a successful invasion.
Reimagined.
So the U.S. chose Okinawa instead, in Japan. The decision spared Taiwan and showed how powerful terrain and preparation can be. So let's talk about Taiwan and why I think it would be very hard for China to invade now or frankly ever. Taiwan's a fortress. Its terrain is so rugged, you can't get a ship within the mile of its shores. So to invade, you would have to stop a mile off the shore and do an amphibious landing where you sent in smaller boats to land on the shore. The problem with that is sending smaller boats in, they're immediately a target for range, medium range weapons. And Taiwan is very well defended. They have defenses in place that were built by the Japanese in the 1940s when the Japanese occupied Taiwan. So they've had over 80 years now to fortify those defenses. So imagine these are not dug out holes in dirt. These are fortified defensive positions with heavy equipment ready and aiming at any approach point. Just getting to Taiwan is difficult, and that is only in the few months that you can get to Taiwan. So the waters are so rough 8 to 9 months out of the year that ships can't even get close. In the few months that you can get close, I imagine Taiwan's on pretty high alert, and again, you can't get within a mile of the shore. What about air superiority and drone strike? Taiwan has a good air defense, but on top of that, Taiwan is very urban terrain. So drone strikes and things like that, unless they're heavy munition, it's not going to do much damage unless you know specifically who you're targeting. But even that's very difficult in the highly urban terrain you would see in the major cities in Taiwan. Let's imagine that you get to Taiwan and you're an invading force. Now what do? So Taiwan on the northern side, where the approach would make sense, are where the main cities are. So you've got Taipei, you've got 5 main cities that most of the inhabitants live in. 80 to 90% of people live in those cities. So urban terrain and urban conflict is extremely difficult. If you're familiar with Sun Tzu, he said avoid urban terrain. It's hard to fight because it's really hard to concentrate firepower in urban terrain. And you're going to end up killing a lot of civilians, which is terrible, and it looks terrible. The other side of Taiwan, so the southeast, is mountainous. So completely rugged mountain terrain. That's the second type of terrain that Sun Tzu said to avoid, is to avoid any type of mountainous or difficult and rugged terrain. First reason is you don't know your way around. So you would have to get a local guide to show you around. Even today with GPS, it's very difficult to get it to work properly in mountainous terrain. Not to mention, the people of Taiwan probably know those mountains way better than an invader would. So you've got mountains on one side, you've got urban terrain on the other. I'll make it better. When you look at the city of Taipei, for example, the capital, it's a bowl shape. So the people live inside, and getting into conflict in a bowl-shaped city is extremely dangerous. Any attempt to get the high ground's probably already taken by surveillance, by military troops. It would be already taken, so you'd have to fight for the high ground. But then once you've got the high ground, are you going to shoot into the bowl? Because the minute you try to descend, you're going to be attacked. So there's just not really a good winning scenario with that type of terrain. So you've got the difficult waters. You can't get close in a naval landing. Once you're there, it's urban terrain or mountainous terrain. And then there's one more factor to consider. The ideology of the people of Taiwan is very strong, and they are preparing for conflict constantly. So the Taiwanese military does an annual battle drill where they pretend like China is invading. They go to their defensive positions, they practice their maneuvers, they act as though the real thing were happening year in and year out. So for them to experience this, they would be extremely well prepared for how they're going to respond. And they probably have evacuation plans. They probably have planned for scenarios in urban or mountainous terrain. They probably plan for all of the possibilities of that type of conflict. Whereas China, being an outsider, would be at a huge disadvantage invading such a well-prepared country. The other reason that Another reason that people say Taiwan has not been invaded is due to their alliances. So there's the Taiwan Defense Act that the United States is part of. Another big reason that China hasn't invaded Taiwan is because Taiwan has strong alliances. There are many democratic nations that support Taiwan. Taiwan is the democratic version of China. Mao Zedong ran out the Nationalist Party, which were the Democrats, and they moved to Taiwan and stood up a democracy. So a lot of democratic countries support Taiwan and would support them militarily in conflict with China. So what is China going to do? China definitely wants to take Taiwan back. They've made it very clear. So what's the plan there if Taiwan's very hard to invade? Well, if you go back to some of Sun Tzu's works, there are steps that China could take to get Taiwan into a position where the conflict would be easier, or maybe it wouldn't be necessarily a head-to-head conflict. So some of the things that Sun Tzu said is to isolate your enemy from their allies. China's done a lot of work over the years to build alliances around the world, to build economic partnerships, and to build cultural partnerships and relationships. So China is very much attempting to build those alliances for many reasons, economic reasons, etc., but also to isolate Taiwan at some point and take their alliances away. And what we're seeing with President Trump saying that Taiwan should pay for security and things like that are very alarming comments. The United States passed the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979 by both chambers of Congress. It was signed by President Carter. And since then, we have had de facto diplomatic relations with Taiwan. We've also stated that any attempt to retake Taiwan, to seize Taiwan, or harm Taiwan through whether it's boycott, embargo, or military action, we have the right to provide military defense. In other words, if China tries to take Taiwan, we are to some extent defending Taiwan's sovereignty. And for the president to come out and say that Taiwan should pay for that, it really goes against the values and the intent of the Taiwan Relations Act, which was that it was actually created because of President Carter tried to end diplomatic ties with Taiwan due to pressure from the PRC. And so Congress passed this act that another president can't do that. It's very interesting that President Trump is trying to change the agreement with Taiwan when there's an act in place that specifically was created so that a president can't unilaterally change relations with Taiwan. And the reason is because the United States, being a democracy, being a defender of democracy around the world, stands on principles in supporting Taiwan's sovereignty and other nations' sovereignty. If I had to describe Taiwan's defense strategy in a nutshell, I would say that Taiwan is fortified. They're extremely hard to reach, not because they're hiding, but because they control every inch of access to them. I think so often in life we look at the size of two opponents and we assume the bigger one should win. And many times that's the case. But the effort that Taiwan has gone through, not to mention just the way the terrain is, has created a very strong defense that if the PRC does decide to invade China, I imagine it'll be a very long, a very expensive, and a very deadly invasion that would probably be regarded by many as a huge mistake. All right, there you have it, folks. A little rundown on Taiwan's defenses and why they're not such an easy target. Thank you for listening. Please remember to like and subscribe, and always stay 2 moves ahead.